Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving into redistribution. It's a concept that gets thrown around a lot, especially in political philosophy and just general discussions about, well, politics and society, really. And you've brought us a piece from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on redistribution. So let's deep dive into this. What do you think?
It's a great piece. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great resource for getting into these topics.
It is, yes. You're a philosopher, right?
Yeah.
So when you hear redistribution, are you thinking about more than just taxes and welfare? Are you thinking about the philosophical implications?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more to it than just taxes and welfare. And the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy kind of lays out a framework for thinking about it. It's kind of like a four-piece puzzle.
Oh, okay. I like that. A philosophy puzzle, all right.
So the first piece would be the subjects. So we're talking about who is actually having their holdings change, who's getting more or less of something. So it could be individuals, it could be groups, like the top 1% versus everyone else, or it could even be nations.
Right. So we've got to figure out who the players are, right off the bat, before we can even, talk about what is being redistributed. Okay, got it. What's the next piece of the puzzle?
So the next one is baseline. And this is where things get really interesting and kind of tricky, because the baseline is, well, what are we comparing the situation to? And that can actually shift depending on who's talking.
Okay, a shifting baseline. That is tricky. Could you give me an example of how that plays out in the real world?
Yeah, so there's a good example in the article about income redistribution in the U.S., and it involves a U.S. congressional study, and depending on which year between 1979 and 1987 you pick as the baseline, you get completely different answers as to whether redistribution happened and to what extent.
So, if I wanted to argue that, there was a lot of redistribution going on, I might pick a year where, inequality was particularly high as my starting point. But then, someone arguing against redistribution might be like, no, look at this year where things were more equal. Redistribution isn't really a problem. It's all about framing, isn't it?
Exactly. That's why it's so important to be aware of what baseline is being used when we're talking about redistribution, because it really does change the picture completely.
Okay, yeah, I see. This is getting philosophically complex. We're not just dealing with numbers, We're dealing with, interpretations and perspectives and, yeah. Okay, so what are the other two pieces of our little redistribution puzzle here?
So the third piece would be the social mechanism, which is how did this happen? How did this redistribution occur? What was the causal story? Was it, government policy? Was it social norms changing? Was it some, a natural disaster or something?
Right, so understanding the cause and effect here, what are the forces that led to this redistribution? Okay, so we're looking beyond just the numbers. We're looking at the historical and social context. I'm with you.
Right, exactly. And then the final piece, the fourth piece, would be the goods themselves. So what exactly is being redistributed?
Okay, I know money is probably the obvious one, but you were saying earlier it goes beyond that. Can you say a little bit more about what kinds of things we might be talking about here?
Yeah, so money is often at the center of discussions about redistribution, but it's not the only thing, right? We can think about opportunities, access to education, healthcare, even things like clean air, voting rights. All these things can be subject to redistribution.
Right, yeah, so it's not just about economic resources. It's about access to all the things that make it possible for people to live, a good life, to flourish, to be well.
Yeah. Exactly. And I think that's why this is, it's a concept that's so relevant to philosophy, because it really touches on those big questions of, justice, fairness, what kind of society we want to live in. And yeah.
All right. So it seems like we've kind of put together the frame of our puzzle here. Now we need to start looking at, the philosophical implications of each of these pieces. And maybe a good place to start would be with that tricky concept of baseline. Now, the article talks about two main ways that philosophers think about baselines, diachronic and synchronic. Can you break those down for us a little bit?
Yeah, so diachronic redistribution basically involves comparing how things are distributed over time. So, you might look at, say, income inequality in a country in 1950 versus today and see, has the gap between the rich and poor widened or narrowed? That would be an example of a diachronic comparison.
So it's like taking a historical snapshot and seeing, how the distribution of resources has evolved over time, who gained, who lost out. Okay, got it.
Yeah, exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia uses a nice example of Taiwan's land reform, which took place over a decade, and it led to a significant reduction in income inequality. So that would be an example of diachronic redistribution because we're looking at those changes over time.
So we're not just looking at the end result, but we're looking at like the process of how things got there, the historical trajectory of like how redistribution happened.
Exactly. And I think that historical perspective is really important because it helps us understand the motivations behind, policies and the impact they had on different groups. It kind of avoids taking just like a static view of the situation.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, so let's move on to that other type of baseline. You mentioned synchronic. Now, you said this one can get kind of mind-bending. What makes it so tricky?
Yeah, so with synchronic redistribution, we're comparing the current distribution to a hypothetical one. So instead of looking at change over time, we're kind of imagining what if scenarios. Like, what would the distribution look like under different circumstances?
Okay, so we're getting into like the realm of thought experiments here. It sounds a little abstract. Can you give me like a concrete example to help wrap my head around it?
Sure. Imagine a world with no inheritance laws, for example. How might that change the distribution of wealth and resources compared to our current system, where inheritance is a big factor? That would be a question of synchronic redistribution because we're comparing the current reality to a hypothetical scenario.
Okay, I see. So we're kind of creating these thought experiments to like isolate certain variables and explore their potential effects.
Exactly. And these hypothetical scenarios, they're really important for philosophers because they help us think about, those concepts of fairness, justice, desert, and it allows us to go beyond just describing how things are and start asking how they ought to be.
Okay, so this is where like the philosophical rubber meets the road, right? We're not just analyzing data. We're actually like engaging in moral reasoning, exploring different principles of distributive justice. But before we get, too deep into those philosophical weeds, I think we should probably pause here and let our listener, digest these first few pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I think we've laid a good foundation by, kind of outlining that framework for understanding redistribution. And then in the next part, we can really start, piecing together some of the more complex and nuanced aspects of this concept. Welcome back to our deep dive into redistribution. So before the break, we were starting to talk about synchronic redistribution, those kind of like hypothetical situations that philosophers use to think about, well, what a just distribution of goods might look like.
Right, right. We're going into those what-if scenarios, imagining like these alternative realities where things are structured differently. And you mentioned that these hypothetical baselines can get pretty complex. Can you give us some more concrete examples of the types of scenarios that like philosophers are actually considering here?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Stanford Encyclopedia article highlights three main types of hypothetical baselines that are particularly relevant to, these philosophical discussions of redistribution.
Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Lay it on me. What are these hypothetical baselines?
All right. So the first type involves kind of imagining what things would be like if certain historical events or policies hadn't happened. For instance, like what would the distribution of wealth in the United States look like today if slavery had never existed?
That's a huge question. It makes you realize how these like historical injustices can really have a lasting impact on the distribution of resources, even centuries later. It's not just about the immediate impact, it's about the legacy.
Absolutely. And then the second type of hypothetical baseline involves imagining a world without any taxes at all. So this allows us to examine the role of, government intervention in shaping how resources are distributed.
Okay, so that's a popular scenario among, libertarians,
Yeah.
right? They often argue that taxation is theft. But I imagine even they would have to admit that like a world with zero government would face some pretty, serious challenges, right? Like who would build the roads or like fund education or provide for the most vulnerable?
Yeah, you raise a good point. This hypothetical baseline of no taxes isn't necessarily meant to be like a blueprint for a utopia. It's more of a thought experiment that helps us understand like what are the justifications for and the consequences of different levels of government intervention.
Yeah, it's like a philosophical laboratory where we can kind of like isolate these variables and see what happens. Right?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's the third type of hypothetical baseline?
So the third type, and this is perhaps the most challenging one to wrap our heads around, is the idea of everyone getting exactly what they contribute to society. So this baseline attempts to establish a direct link between, like individual effort or merit and the rewards they receive.
Oh, okay. This one sounds like a real head scratcher. Like, how do you even begin to measure someone's contribution to society?
Yeah.
Do we like assign a monetary value to every job and every action? And like, what about people who, maybe their work isn't easily quantifiable in economic terms, like stay-at-home parents, volunteers, artists. Their work is so valuable, but it's hard to put a price tag on it.
Yeah, you've really hit the nail on the head there. Even economists, they struggle to define and measure individual contributions in a way that feels fair and comprehensive.
Wow.
It raises those really deep questions about, the nature of value, the relationship between, individual effort and those broader social outcomes, and even the role of like luck and circumstance in, shaping people's success.
It seems like this hypothetical baseline, while, intriguing, it's almost impossible to like actually apply in the real world. It's too abstract and subjective.
Yeah, you're right. This particular baseline is more of a theoretical ideal than, a practical framework for policymaking. But I do think it serves a valuable purpose by, forcing us to think critically about the relationship between individual merit and those social rewards.
It challenges us to examine those assumptions that we make about like who deserves what, and maybe consider, some alternative models of distribution that might be more just and equitable.
Exactly. And this kind of leads us to a really interesting subset of hypothetical baselines, what the Stanford Encyclopedia calls moralized subjunctive baselines.
Okay, moralized subjunctive baselines. Now we're really getting into the philosophical weeds. Break this one down for me.
All right, so think of these baselines as asking, what if everyone got what they morally deserved? So it's about aligning the distribution of goods with some, pre-existing conception of, well, like moral worth or entitlement.
Right, right. And this is where those debates about distributive justice, like, really get heated,
Yeah.
right? Because there are so many different philosophical theories about, like, what people deserve.
Yeah.
You've got libertarian notions of, self-ownership, and then you've got more egalitarian principles. Everyone has equal worth.
Exactly. And those moralized baselines kind of force us to confront those very fundamental philosophical questions. Is it about everyone having an equal share? Is it about rewarding effort and talent? Is it about making sure everyone has at least a basic minimum standard of living? Or is it about, like maximizing the overall well-being of society as a whole?
I mean, these are tough questions.
Yeah.
And it's no wonder that, redistribution is such a contentious issue. It's not just about economics. It's about these, like, deeply held values and beliefs about what a just society should look like.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it does a good job of highlighting that complexity, right? There isn't a single universally agreed upon answer to these questions. Different philosophical perspectives will lead to, well, different conclusions about the legitimacy and the scope of redistribution.
It sounds like, navigating these debates requires, like, a lot of careful consideration of different values and principles. It's not just about, like, picking a side. It's about understanding, like, the reasoning and the logic behind each perspective. But before we get completely lost in these, like, abstract theories, I think we should try to bring this back down to earth a little bit.
Yeah, agreed. We've kind of explored the theoretical framework for understanding redistribution. Now it's time to look at those real-world applications and implications of the concept.
Right, right. Let's move from the hypothetical to the actual and see how these philosophical ideas actually play out in the world of, like policy and programs and political debates. We'll continue this exploration in the final part of our deep dive. All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into redistribution. We've talked about the framework, the baselines, those hypothetical scenarios, and now it's time to really grapple with how these philosophical ideas translate into actual policies and debates. I mean, where do we even begin with that?
Well, I think one of the key takeaways from the Stanford Encyclopedia article is that even the very definition of redistribution is up for debate. Like, what one person considers a totally legitimate form of redistribution, another person might see as a complete infringement on individual rights.
Right, and that just highlights how important it is to understand those different philosophical perspectives that are at play. Can you give me an example of that kind of, like, definitional clash?
Sure. The article talks about this distinction between what they call redistributive taxes and benefit taxes. And this distinction really gets to the heart of some of those core disagreements about the role of government.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break it down for me. What's the difference between these two types of taxes?
Okay, so think of redistributive taxes as those that are specifically designed to, transfer wealth from one group to another. So like classic examples would be, welfare programs, food stamps, things like that, where money is collected from those with higher incomes and then redistributed to those in need.
Okay, yeah, so it's about intentionally, like, Leveling the playing field.
Precisely. But then you have what they call benefit taxes, which are levied to fund public services that benefit everyone in society, regardless of their income level. So think about things like, roads, parks, public schools.
So the argument here is that these taxes aren't really redistribution because everyone benefits from the services that they fund. Like everyone uses roads, everyone enjoys parks, everyone needs, an educated populace.
That's the idea. However, the Stanford Encyclopedia also points out that even those programs that are seen as, primarily benefiting the poor, they can also have these kind of indirect benefits for the wealthy as well.
Right, right. I mean, for example, social safety nets can reduce crime, which, creates a safer and more stable society for everyone, including the wealthy. It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats. So,
Exactly, exactly. And so this kind of intertwining of benefits, it makes it really hard to draw a clear line between those redistributive and benefit taxes in practice. And it also highlights, how interconnected our social and economic systems really are.
it seems like every action, every policy has these ripple effects that go way beyond the intended target. It makes you realize that redistribution isn't just about, transferring money. It's about shaping the very fabric of society.
Absolutely. And the article brings up another concept that I think is really important for philosophers to grapple with, which is the idea of rights infringing transfers.
Rights infringing transfers. Okay, that sounds pretty intense. What does that mean exactly?
So it's this idea that even taxes, which are generally seen as a legitimate function of government, they can be seen as violating individual rights if they're perceived as taking something that someone is rightfully entitled to.
Right, and this gets back to those really fundamental questions about, property rights, self-ownership, the role of the state. Like some people, libertarians, for example, would argue that any form of taxation is coercive and therefore, unjust. Others might argue that no, taxation is necessary to, ensure the well-being of society as a whole and to protect those who are most vulnerable.
It's a classic philosophical clash, and the Stanford Encyclopedia, it doesn't try to take sides. It just lays out those different arguments and encourages us to think critically about those issues.
Right. It's not about finding easy answers. It's about understanding the nuances of these different perspectives and the values that underpin them. So as a philosopher yourself, what do you think is the most important takeaway from our, deep dive into redistribution?
Well, for me, it's really this recognition that redistribution is not just, an economic concept. It's deeply philosophical. It
Yeah.
forces us to confront these big questions about justice, about fairness, the role of the state, and what it even means to have, a good society.
Yeah, and as we've seen, there are no simple answers to these questions. Every choice, every attempt to redistribute resources has these trade-offs and these implications that, go way beyond the immediate impact.
Exactly. And that's why I think this ongoing dialogue, this, critical engagement with these issues, it's so crucial. We need to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep, striving for a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And I think the Stanford Encyclopedia article is a great starting point for that ongoing exploration. Gives us the tools to unpack these complexities, to understand these different perspectives, and to engage in this, really thoughtful debate about these important issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a valuable resource for anyone who wants to delve deeper into this topic, whether they're a philosopher or not.
All right. And on that note, we'll leave our listener with that final thought. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive into redistribution. We encourage you to continue the conversation, to check out that Stanford Encyclopedia article, and keep those philosophical wheels turning.